Part 1. The Unexpected Reunion. Ethan Carter had always been the one she loved, her childhood sweetheart, her first love. They had shared dreams, laughter, and a future that seemed destined to be together. But life had a way of changing the course of even the most promising paths. Sophie never imagined that the man she had once vowed to wait for would become a distant memory. Yet, here she was, staring at her phone screen, hearing the voice of her mother filled with excitement on the other end. "Is this true? You're really going back to us, to marry James Harrison?" Sophie's heart sank. Her mother's enthusiasm felt like a punch to the stomach, as if the weight of the past years came crashing down all at once. She had made her decision. She had already packed her bags, ready to return to the city to start a new chapter with James, a man who had been her rock, the one who had helped her when Ethan had betrayed her. She had no time to wait for a man who had once promised her the world, to leave her standing in the shadows of his ambitions. As she heard the tremor in her mother's voice, Sophie made up her mind. James was more than just a solution to her broken heart. He was a kind, stable man who had supported her grieving family when they had lost everything. He had helped arrange her previous burial after Ethan's cruel betrayal. He had supported her family in ways Sophie could never repay, but she could try. She could give him the happiness he had always deserved. "I'm ready, Mom. I will marry James," Sophie said firmly, her voice unwavering. Her mother's excitement was palpable. "Good, that's good. I'll arrange everything immediately." Sophie hung up, a strange weight lifted from her shoulders. But just as the air around her seemed to clear, she heard a voice from the hallway, a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. "Sophie, wait." It was Ethan. Her body froze, her heart pounded in her chest. She turned around, only to find Ethan standing in the doorway of the faculty dormitory, his eyes red, his face twisted in confusion and hurt. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the day she made the decision to let him go. His voice trembled as he asked, "Didn't we agree that you would wait for me?" Sophie's breath caught in her throat, the old feelings rushing back. But the pain of those memories was swiftly drowned by the truth of the moment. She was no longer the naive girl who had once believed in Ethan's promises. She was a woman, shaped by the trials she had faced, and she had made her choice. "I've moved on, Ethan," Sophie said, her words cold but steady. "I'm done waiting." Ethan's face paled, his lips quivering. He had never expected this. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the panic that began to rise as he realized she wasn't the same person anymore. The girl who once clung to him had disappeared, replaced by Samion. Stronger. Sophie's eyes flickered to Rachel, who stood beside Ethan, her eyes wide with surprise, a knowing look in them. Rachel had always been a part of Ethan's life, and Sophie had never trusted her. Now, as she watched them both stand there, Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of finality wash over her. "I've already made my decision," Sophie said, her voice unwavering. "I'm going back to the city. I'm going to marry James." Ethan's jaw clenched as he watched Sophie turn away, her back to him. The door clicked shut behind her, but his gaze lingered for a moment, as if waiting for her to change her mind. But Sophie was done waiting. She had made her choice, and she would no longer be trapped in the past. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a much more complicated journey than she had anticipated. What she didn't realize yet was that the past, like a shadow, was never as far behind as it seemed. And that night, everything would change again. Part 2. The Burden of the Past. Sophie left the faculty dormitory with a heaviness in her heart, but her steps were resolute. She couldn't understand why Ethan had come after her, why he had assumed that she would still wait for him. His words, "Didn't we agree that you would wait for me?" echoed in her mind, but they were no longer the promises of a love that would last forever. They were just words, empty, futile words that carried with them the weight of memories Sophie was desperate to escape. She stepped out into the crisp air, the night sky stretched above her, the stars faint against the dark expanse. The warmth of the campus dormitory was behind her now, replaced by the chill that seemed to seep deep into her bones. Yet, her resolve was unwavering. She was ready to move on, to finally embrace the future that had been waiting for her all alone. The future that Ethan had so callously denied her. But the path to happiness was never easy. Sophie had spent countless nights wondering if she had made the right decision. She had never questioned her love for Ethan, but now, looking back, she saw the flaws in their relationship that she had once been blind to. Ethan had always promised that things would get better, that they would build a future together once he had established his career. But that day never came. Every time she had given him a chance, he had failed her. The years of waiting had only led to disappointment, and Sophie had grown weary of waiting for a man who had nothing to offer but empty promises. As she walked through the quiet streets toward the bus stop, Sophie tried to shake off the lingering thoughts of Ethan. She didn't want to dwell on him any longer, not when she had James by her side now. James Harrison was everything Ethan wasn't: steady, reliable, kind, and always there when she needed him. He was the man Sophie had turned to when her world had fallen apart, the man who had comforted her when Ethan had betrayed her. James had never asked for anything in return for his kindness. He had stood by her without expecting anything, without ever trying to manipulate her or take advantage of her. He had been a true friend, someone Sophie had come to rely on, and over time, their friendship had blossomed into something deeper. Unlike Ethan, James had never made Sophie feel like she was just waiting for him to catch up with her life. He had always been there, supporting her dreams and helping her achieve the goals she had set for herself. Sophie reached the bus stop and waited for the vehicle that would take her back to the city. She thought of her parents, how excited they would be to see her return, how happy they would be when they learned she had decided to marry James. Her parents had never been thrilled with her relationship with Ethan, and for good reason. They had always worried about her future with him, unsure if he would ever be able to provide the stability and security she needed. And now, Sophie understood why. She could no longer IGN. Or the truth, Ethan had never truly valued her. He had always taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there, waiting for him. The bus arrived, and Sophie climbed aboard, taking a seat by the window. As the vehicle rolled away from the campus, she looked out at the familiar scenery, the streets and buildings that had once been a part of her life. But now, everything seemed distant, as if she were leaving behind a past she could never return to. She thought back to the conversation with her mother. When Sophie had told her she was ready to marry James, her mother had been thrilled. It was a relief to hear her mother's voice crack with excitement, to know that she had finally made the decision to move on from Ethan and embrace the future with someone who truly cared for her. But the words her mother had said still lingered in Sophie's mind. "Are you sure you're done with Ethan? You know he still loves you, right?" Sophie had nodded, though deep down, she had known that Ethan's love was no longer enough. He had never really loved her the way she needed him to. It was more about convenience for him, about the idea of her being there, waiting for him, as he chased after his career. But Sophie was done being the person who waited. She had been patient for far too long, and it had only led to heartache. As the bus sped down the road, Sophie glanced at her phone, checking for any messages. There was nothing from Ethan, no desperate calls or texts begging her to reconsider. Sophie couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or disappointed. She had expected him to fight for her, to try to convince her to change her mind. But instead, he had simply vanished, his promises now nothing more than echoes in the past. Was this how it was meant to end? Was she really going to let him go without a second thought? The bus arrived at the station, and Sophie stepped off, her feet hitting the pavement with a soft thud. The city greeted her with its familiar hum, the sound of people bustling about their lives. As she walked toward her apartment, she felt the weight of her decision press on her chest, but she knew it was the right one. She had to let go of the past in order to embrace the future. And the future, for her, was with James. That night, as Sophie sat in her apartment, unpacking the few thin GS she had brought with her, she received a message from James. "Hey, Sophie, just wanted to check in. How was your trip? I can't wait to see you. Let's make sure we meet up soon." Sophie smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. James was always so considerate, so thoughtful. He never pushed her, never demanded anything from her. He simply wanted her to be happy. And in that moment, Sophie realized something she had never fully understood before: love was not about waiting for Samion to catch up. It was about finding someone who would walk beside you, supporting you every step of the way. The next morning, Sophie called her parents, telling them the news. Her mother, as expected, was overjoyed, and her father's voice softened with relief. Sophie had always known that her parents wanted the best for her, but they had never been as supportive of Ethan as they were of James. Sophie could hear the pride in her mother's voice when she said, "I'm so proud of you, Sophie. I always knew you would make the right choice." As Sophie ended the call, she felt a sense of finality wash over her. She was done with the past. She was done with Ethan. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly moving forward. But little did she know, the past was never truly as far behind as it seemed. Part 3. A moment of clarity. The days passed slowly after Sophie's decision. Each morning, as she awoke in the comfort of her own apartment, she felt the weight of her choices. Yet, despite the uncertainty that crept into her mind at times, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. Peace that she had finally done something for herself. Peace that she was finally moving forward, away from the haunting memories of a love that never was. James had always been there, like a steady hand waitin' for her to reach out. Now, Sophie realized that she had already found the love she had been searching for all along, though it had always been right in front of her. It wasn't the passionate, whirlwind love she had once imagined. No, it was something more enduring. It was the kind of love that would stand the test of time, the kind that was built on trust, respect, and a shared history that went deeper than the surface. It was a love that promised to be more than just a fleeting moment. It was the foundation for a future she could now see clearly. Her thoughts drifted back to the night before when she had received a message from James. He had been waiting for her, patient as always. Sophie hadn't realized how much she had missed him until she saw his name on her phone. The message had been simple: "Hey, Sophie. Just wanted to check in. How was your trip? I can't wait to see you. Let's meet soon." It was a reminder that James wasn't just waiting for her to make a decision. He had already made up his mind. He was ready to move forward with her, no questions asked. His love wasn't conditional, it was unconditional, and Sophie knew deep down that this was what she had been searching for all along. That evening, Sophie met James at a cafe downtown. The streets were busy with people rushing home from work, the buzz of the city filling the air. When she spotted James, standing by the entrance with his warm smile and steady presence, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. He was wearing his usual uniform, sharp and crisp, but his eyes softened as they met hers. "Hey, Sophie," he said, his voice as warm as ever. "It's so good to see you." Sophie smiled back, feeling the tension in her chest melt away. "You too, James. I've missed you." They sat down at a small table by the window, the city lights casting a soft glow across the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. Their silence spoke volumes, and in that moment, Sophie realized that everything she had been searching for in life was right here, in this room with him. "I've been thinking about everything," Sophie said, her voice quiet but steady. "About the decision I made, about Ethan and everything that happened. And I'm finally at peace with it, James. I'm ready. I'm ready to be with you." James reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and reassuring. "Sophie, you don't have to say anything more. I'm just happy you're here. I've always been here for you, and I always will be." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of finally finding her place in the world. She squeezed his hand. Grateful for his unwavering support. "I've been so lost for so long, James. I thought I had to wait for someone who would never come, and now I realize that I've been looking in the wrong direction all along. You've always been here. You've always been the one who truly cared for me." James smiled softly, his eyes warm with affection. "You don't have to thank me, Sophie. I'm just happy to see you finally realizing it. We both deserve to be happy, and I know we'll make it happen together." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they talked about everything and nothing at all. But Sophie's mind kept returning to one thing: how had she not seen this before? How had she let herself fall into the trap of believing that love was only about waiting for Samion to come back, when the person who had always been by her side was James? As the evening wore on, Sophie felt a sense of clarity settle within her. She was finally ready to embrace the future, to let go of the past, and to walk alongside James as they began their life together. No more waiting. No more wondering. No more uncertainty. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Sophie had called her parents to update them on her decision, and they were beyond thrilled. They had always supported James, knowing that he was the kind of man who would take care of her. Sophie felt a warmth in her heart as she realized that she was about to make them proud, just as they had always made her proud. James, too, was busy with his own plans. His military career had always been demanding, but he had promised Sophie that he would be there for her, no matter what. His work was important to him, but he had made it clear that Sophie would always come first. Sophie couldn't help but smile at the thought of having someone so dependable by her side. She was finally ready to take the next step, to build a life that was full of love and promise. But the past, as Sophie had learned, was never too far behind. One morning, Sophie received a call from a number she didn't recognize. It was a local area code, but she couldn't quite place the number. Curiosity got the better of her, and she picked up the phone. "Hello? Sophie, it's Ethan." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly regained her composure. It had been weeks since she had heard from him, and she had hoped that would be the last of it. But here he was, reaching out once again. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, her voice steady but distant. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice strained. "It's important." Sophie felt a surge of irritation rise in her chest. She had moved on. She had made peace with everything, and now here he was, showing up when it was too late. "I don't think there's anything left to say," Sophie replied, her tone cold. "I've made my decision, Ethan. I'm with James now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sophie could almost feel Ethan's hesitation, his uncertainty. But she wasn't about to fall for his games again. "Please, Sophie," Ethan's voice cracked. I need to know that I didn't ruin everything. I need to know that you're okay." Sophie clenched her fists, the memories of their past flooding her mind. "You didn't ruin anything, Ethan. You made your choice, and I made mine. I'm happy now. You should be happy too. I'm not waiting for you anymore." Ethan let out a long, shuddering breath. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I needed more time to figure things out." Sophie's heart hardened. "You had plenty of time, Ethan. And you wasted it. I can't keep waiting for someone who doesn't know what they want." "I ever thought you would leave," Ethan said quietly. "I thought you would always be there, waiting for me." Sophie shook her head, the finality in her voice clear. "I'm sorry, Ethan. But I'm not the same person I was before. I've moved on. And so should you." The line went silent, and Sophie hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She had said what needed to be said, but part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's presence was always going to linger in her life, like an unfinished chapter that would never truly end. But she had made her choice. She had moved on, and that was all that mattered now. Part 4. A New Beginning. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie felt her life slowly starting to shift in ways she had never anticipated. She was now living with a sense of clarity and purpose that she had never experienced before. With every passing day, her love for James grew deeper, more secure. James was everything she needed and more. He was steady, kind, and had a quiet strength that Sophie found both comforting and inspiring. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly at ease with someone, but with James, she felt like she had finally found the place where she belonged. Yet, even as she settled into this newfound peace, the past continued to cast its shadow. Ethan's last phone call had left Sophie with mixed emotions. He had sounded desperate, but Sophie had held her ground, unwilling to let him drag her back into the chaos of their past. It had been a difficult decision. But she knew she couldn't keep looking back. She couldn't keep waiting for someone who had never truly valued her, someone who was only now starting to realize what he had lost. James, as always, was by her side through it all. He had listened patiently when Sophie spoke of her past, offering her the comfort and understanding she needed. But there was no pressure from him, no urgency to move forward. James was content to let Sophie heal in her own time, trusting that eventually, the past would fade into the distance, just like the memories of Ethan. One evening, as Sophie and James sat together on the couch in her apartment, James spoke up, his voice soft but filled with warmth. "Sophie, I know you've been through a lot, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Sophie turned to face him, her heart swelling at his words. She had heard many promises in the past, but there was something different about James. He wasn't just saying the right things, he was living them every day. He showed up for her when it mattered, and that meant more than any words ever could. "I know, James," Sophie replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm so grateful for that. I'm starting to see now that I don't need to carry the past with me. You're right here. And that's N. Oof." James smiled, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I'm glad you see that, Sophie. You deserve to be happy, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you are." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. She had been carrying so much for so long, trying to make sense of her past, trying to understand what went wrong with Ethan. But with James, there was no need to question. He was a constant, a steady presence that didn't require her to change or be anything other than who she was. Over the next few weeks, Sophie began to make arrangements for her future. She had decided to move in with James, finally taking the step of living together. It felt like the right time, and James was more than ready to start this new chapter of their lives. Her parents were thrilled when she told them the news, and although they had always hoped she would end up with someone who could provide for her, they trusted James and Dee saw how happy he made her. But as Sophie and James took steps toward their new life together, Ethan remained a lingering presence in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but wonder what he was doing, if he had finally come to terms with the fact that their time together had ended. Every now and then, Sophie would hear snippets of news about him through mutual acquaintances, how he had moved back to the city but had struggled to find work, how he had been working odd jobs just to make ends meet. But Sophie didn't dwell on it. She had made her decision, and she was moving forward. She had no intention of revisiting the past, no matter how much Ethan might try to reach out to her. One afternoon, as Sophie was sorting through some of her old things in her apartment, she came across a letter from Ethan. It was tucked away in a box that she had packed away years ago, when she had first decided to leave him behind. The letter was yellowed with age, the paper brittle and worn. Sophie stared at it for a long moment, unsure if she should even open it. The letter was a relic of a past she had tried so hard to forget, but curiosity got the better of her. She slowly unfolded the letter and began to read. The words were familiar, Ethan's handwriting, full of emotion and regret. As she read, Sophie could feel the familiar ache in her chest, but it was different this time. She no longer felt the desperate longing she had once had. The letter spoke of Ethan's pain, his regret over the choices he had made, and his hope that they could somehow find a way back to each other. He apologized for everything, for leaving her behind, for failing her when she had needed him the most. But as Sophie finished reading the letter, she felt no anger, no resentment, only a quiet sense of relief. She had heard all of this before, and it was no longer enough. Ethan's words couldn't undo the past, couldn't change the years of waiting and disappointment. She had moved on, and the past was just that past. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the box, and tucked it away once more. The next day, Sophie met James for lunch. They sat at their usual cafe, sipping coffee and talking about their plans for the future. It felt good to be able to talk about the future without the weight of the past hanging over her. Sophie had never truly realized how much her past with Ethan had held her back, how much she had let it control her decisions. But now, with James, there was a freedom she had never known. As they talked, James smiled and reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Sophie, I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft. "We've been through a lot, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, always. But I think it's time for us to start thinking about our own future. No more looking back. What do you think?" Sophie smiled, feeling her heart swell. She had never felt so sure about anything in her life. I think it's time, she replied. No more looking back. Only forward. James smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and affection. Good. Then let's start planning our future together. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt truly at peace. She had let go of the past, and now she was ready to build a life with James, a life full of love, stability, and the promise of tomorrow. But as she left the cafe that day, a strange feeling lingered in the back of her mind. Something was about to change again, something that would test her newfound peace in ways she never expected. She couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't quite done with her yet. Part 5. Unexpected turns. Life, Sophie soon realized, was not something you could predict, no matter how carefully you planned. She had spent so many years trying to understand her relationship with Ethan, trying to make sense of her feelings and their shattered future, that she hadn't realized how quickly everything could change. The peace she had found with James was fragile, a fragile peace that was about to be tested in ways she hadn't imagined. Sophie had just finished a long day at work and was on her way home when she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a number she hadn't recognized, a local area code. Her heart skipped a beat as she wondered if it was someone from her past, someone who might bring news of Ethan. Hello? Sophie answered cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Sophie, it's Rachel. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Rachel. The name alone brought back memories she would rather forget. Rachel had always been a thorn in her side, the person who had never quite accepted the boundaries Sophie had set with Ethan. Over the years, Rachel had managed to worm her way back into Ethan's life, and from the rumors Sophie had heard, she was still there, tangled up in Ethan's messy world. Rachel? Sophie replied, her voice cool but firm. What do you want? I know this is unexpected, but I need to talk to you. It's important. Sophie's mind raced. She had no interest in talking to Rachel, especially after everything that had happened. But something in Rachel's voice sounded different, urgent. Sophie hesitated before responding. Fine. What's so important? There was a brief silence on the other end before Rachel's voice came through again, softer now, tinged with a note of desperation. Ethan. Ethan's in trouble. I don't know who else to turn to, but I think you need to know. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Ethan. Trouble. She couldn't fathom what Rachel was talking about. After everything that had happened, Sophie had convinced herself that Ethan was out of her life for good. But now, the past was coming crashing back in ways she hadn't expected. What happened? Sophie asked, her voice almost a whisper. Rachel let out a deep breath. Ethan's been arrested. He's in jail right now. He's being accused of something he didn't do, and I don't know how to help him. Sophie felt a sharp pang of confusion. Ethan? In trouble? She had always known that Ethan had his flaws, but this was something she hadn't seen coming. She didn't know what to say. Why are you telling me this, Rachel? Sophie asked, her voice suddenly cold. Why should I care about Ethan anymore? He made his choices, and I made mine. I know, Rachel replied quickly, but this is different. He's not the man you think he is. He's changed. And I think he needs you. Sophie couldn't believe what she was hearing. Ethan had changed? After all the pain, the lies, and the broken promises, now he wanted help? She could hardly comprehend the situation. But Rachel's voice, her tone, the desperation, struck something deep inside Sophie. Maybe Rachel was telling the truth. Maybe Ethan had finally realized the consequences of his actions. I don't know what you want me to do, Sophie replied, her voice cracking slightly. I've moved on, Rachel. I'm with James now. I don't think there's anything left for me to do for Ethan. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Rachel spoke again, her voice quieter but more insistent. Sophie, please. I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important. Ethan's not the same person you knew. He made mistakes, yes, but he's trying to make things right. He's scared, and he needs someone who understands him. You were the one person he trusted, the one person who always had his back. I think if anyone can help him, it's you. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. She had always cared for Ethan in her own way, but that love had turned into something else, something bitter, full of regret and hurt. She had moved on, but hearing Rachel's pleas stirred up emotions she thought she had buried. Did Ethan deserve her help? Did he even deserve her time after everything he had put her through? I don't know, Sophie said finally, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know if I can do this. I've already let go of him, Rachel. I've moved on. Rachel's voice softened, almost pleading. Please, Sophie. I wouldn't be calling you if I didn't. Believe it could make a difference. You have a chance to help him. You have a chance to give him something he's never had, closure. Don't you owe it to yourself to have the final say in all of this? Sophie sat down on the edge of her bed, her heart racing. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts that flooded her mind. Ethan's face flashed before her, the good moments, the promises, the pain. She had put it all behind her. She had chosen James, and she had finally found the peace she so desperately needed. But now, she was being asked to confront the past one last time. To revisit everything she had worked so hard to leave behind. Let me think about it, Sophie said, her voice quieter now, resigned. Rachel sighed with relief. Thank you, Sophie. I promise I wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent. I'll be here if you decide to help. Sophie hung up the phone and sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. What was she supposed to do? James had been so supportive, so understanding of everything she had been through. He had never once questioned her decisions, never once made her feel guilty for the choices she had made. He had been the anchor she needed after the storm of her past. But now, the storm was pulling her back in, and the question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Could she help Ethan? Did she owe him that much? The answer wasn't clear, and Sophie didn't know if she was ready to make that choice yet. But she knew one thing: if she did decide to help him, it would change everything. It would change the course of her life once again, pulling her into a past she had worked so hard to escape. As she sat there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from James. Sophie, I've been thinking about everything we talked about earlier. I just want you to kn. Ow, whatever you decide, I'll be here. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. Take your time. Sophie's heart swelled with affection for him. James was everything she needed, everything she had wanted in a partner. But now, she was faced with a choice that could change their future together. With a deep breath, Sophie stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She would have to make a choice. But no matter what she decided, she knew that this moment would define her in ways she couldn't yet understand. Part 6. The Crossroads. Sophie couldn't sleep that night. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the weight of the decision she had to make pressing down on her chest. She had already made so many difficult choices in her life, but this one felt different. This time, she wasn't just deciding for herself, she was deciding for everyone in her life, James, Ethan, and even her parent, T.S., who had supported her through everything. The phone call from Rachel replayed in her mind. Ethan was in trouble, he was in jail, facing accusations that he couldn't clear on his own. And Rachel, despite everything, had reached out to Sophie. Was this some kind of desperate attempt to pull Sophie back into Ethan's tangled mess? Or was Rachel truly telling the truth? Was Ethan really trying to make amends, trying to become the man Sophie had always hoped he could be? Sophie thought about James sitting in his apartment miles away, waiting for her to make up her mind. He had been the constant, the rock she had clung to when everything else had crumbled. He had supported her when she needed it most, and the idea of jeopardizing that with a decision that might pull her back into her past felt wrong. But then, there was Ethan. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to focus, trying to separate the facts from the emotions. She had loved him once, she had given him everything, hoping that one day he would be the man she had always believed he could be. But over time, those feelings had been replaced with resentment, disappointment, and betrayal. He had promised her a future, only to abandon her when things got tough. He had hurt her in ways she hadn't thought possible, and yet here he was again, asking for help. She remembered the look in Rachel's eyes as she had spoken about Ethan's situation. There had been no arrogance, no manipulation. It had been genuine fear, genuine concern. Was that enough to make Sophie reconsider everything? Could she truly walk away from someone who, in the deepest corners of his heart, still seemed to need her? Did she owe him the chance to redeem himself, or was it better to leave him to face the consequences of his actions? Sophie glanced at her phone once more, the screen glowing in the dark room. She could hear James's reassuring words in her mind, "Whatever you decide, I'll be here." His support had always been unwavering, and it was hard to imagine a future without him. He was the steady, reliable man who had always treated her with respect and kindness. He had never once made her feel small or insignificant. But Ethan was a different story. Despite everything he had done, a part of Sophie's heart still ached for him. It wasn't love, not an amour, but a lingering sense of duty. She couldn't forget the person he had once been, the person she had believed in. Could she really turn her back on him now, when he was in need? The clock ticked on, and Sophie knew she couldn't avoid this decision forever. She had to make a choice. The next morning, Sophie woke up feeling no clearer than she had the night before. She knew she couldn't put this off any longer. Ethan's situation was urgent, and Rachel's plea for help had left her in no choice but to confront it head-on. As she stood in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, she found herself staring at the phone in her hand, wondering if she should call Rachel back. But then, a thought stopped her. What if I make a mistake? What if this choice, this one decision, changed everything? She texted James instead. "James, I need to talk to you. It's about Ethan. I don't know what to do. Can we meet?" The response was quick. "Of course. I'm here for you, Sophie. Let's meet tonight." Sophie felt a sense of relief wash over her. James had always been her safe haven, the place where she could turn when everything seemed too overwhelming. She needed him now more than ever. She needed his perspective, his steady guidance. That evening, they met at a quiet cafe, a place where they often went to escape the was of the world. James was already sitting at a table by the window, his dark uniform a stark contrast to the warm, cozy atmosphere of the cafe. When Sophie sat down across from him, he smiled warmly, his eyes filled with understanding. "What's going on, Sophie?" he asked, his voice low, as if sensing the weight on her shoulders. Sophie hesitated, unsure where to begin. The weight of her thoughts pressed on her chest, but as she looked at James, she felt a small flicker of peace. He was here. He wasn't going anywhere. But could she still be that sure of herself when it came to Ethan? "I got a call this morning," Sophie began, her voice quiet. "From Rachel. She said Ethan's in trouble. He's been arrested, and he's facing some serious charges. She said he needs my help." James listened carefully, his expression thoughtful but neutral. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to offer advice. He let Sophie speak, letting her process everything in her own time. "He's in jail, James. He's accused of something he didn't do, and Rachel thinks that if I help him, if I just talk to the right people, I could get him out. She says he's not the same person he used to be." Sophie felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she said the words aloud. Was she really considering this? Was she really going to help him? She had already moved on. She had a life with James now. She had everything she had ever wanted in him. So why was this so hard? James reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. His grip was firm, but not forceful. "Sophie, you've already made your choice. You're here with me. You're building a life together, and I'm proud of that. But I know how much you care. And I understand that you want to help Ethan. But you don't owe him anything. You've given him all the chances in the world, and he's wasted them. It's time for you to let go." Sophie met his gaze, her heart torn. James's words made sense. He was right. She had been there for Ethan before, time and time again, and it had never been enough. She had let him go. She had chosen to move on, to finally build a future for herself, and she couldn't keep looking back. But what if he really has changed? Sophie whispered, the doubt creeping back into her voice. What if I'm the only one who can help him? James squeezed her hand, his eyes steady. Sophie, sometimes helping someone means letting them go. You can't fix everything, and you can't be the one to carry the burden of their mistakes. Ethan made his choices. He chose his path, and you chose yours. You don't have to carry his weight anymore. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the truth in James's words settle within her. This wasn't just about Ethan's redemption. It was about her own peace, her own happiness. She had done everything she could for him. But now, she had to let him go. It was time. I think you're right, Sophie said softly. I've been holding on to something that's already gone. I can't keep letting it control me. James smiled, relief washing over his face. Whatever you decide, I'm here. We're in this together. Sophie leaned back in her chair, the weight on her shoulders slowly lifting. The decision had been made. She didn't need to look back. She was ready to move forward with James, to build the life they both deserved. And this time, she was doing it for herself. Part 7. The Final Decision. Sophie woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The storm of thoughts and emotions had finally settled, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right decision. She had faced her past, confronted her feelings, and now, it was time to embrace her future. The day before, after meeting with James, Sophie had decided not to intervene in Ethan's troubles. She had made peace with the fact that some things were out of her control. Ethan had made his choices, and she had made hers. The past had no hold over her anymore. She wasn't going to let it drag her back into a place she had already left behind. Sophie was ready to move forward, to build a life with James, a life based on trust, love, and mutual respect. Her phone buzzed early that morning. She looked at the screen and saw Rachel's name flashing. Sophie hesitated for a moment, but the decision had already been made. She couldn't help Ethan any more than she already had. Not now, not after everything. Taking a deep breath, Sophie answered the call. Sophie, Rachel's voice broke off, sounding almost desperate. I just wanted to let you know. Ethan's been released. The charges were dropped. I don't know how it happened, but it's over. He's free. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. She had made peace with this. She had chosen not to get involved, and nothing could change that now. That's good to hear, Rachel, Sophie said calmly. I'm glad things worked out for him. But I can't be a part of this anymore. I've moved on. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sophie could hear Rachel's breath hitching, as if she were struggling to find the right words. I understand, Rachel finally said, her voice quieter. I wanted you to know. You've always been important to Ethan. Even now. But I see that you've moved on, and I respect that. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said. She had let go of Ethan, and it was time to move forward. Goodbye, Rachel, Sophie said softly, before hanging up the phone. Sophie felt a strange sense of closure as she placed the phone back on the table. Ethan was free, but that didn't change anything for her. She had made the right choice. She had chosen to let go of the past, to stop carrying the burden of someone else's mistakes. She was ready to embrace her future, and that future was with James. Later that afternoon, Sophie and James met at the park, as they often did when they needed to talk. James was waiting for her under their favorite oak tree, a quiet smile on his face as he saw her approaching. He had always been the of man who didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough to make Sophie feel safe and loved. Hey, James greeted her, standing up and pulling her into a warm hug. How are you doing? Sophie smiled, resting her head against his chest. I'm doing better. I finally made peace with everything. It feels like I've been carrying around this weight for so long, and now it's gone. James pulled back slightly, his hands on her shoulders as he looked at her with such tenderness that it made Sophie's heart swell. You don't have to carry anything alone, Sophie. I'm here with you. Always. Sophie's eyes filled with gratitude as she looked up at him. I know. And that's all I need. They sat down on the bench beneath the oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on her face, and for the first time in a long while, she truly felt at peace. I've thought a lot about what you said, Sophie began, her voice steady. About how sometimes the right thing to do is to let go, even when it's hard. I think I was holding on to Ethan because I felt like I owed him something. But I don't anymore. James nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. You don't owe him anything, Sophie. You gave him everything. You did your best. But now it's your time to live for you. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with affection for him. Ever realized how much I needed to hear that? How much I needed to hear that it's okay to let go. James gently took her hand in his, intertwining their fingers. It's more than okay. You deserve to be happy. And I'm going to make sure you are. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. I'm already happy, James. I have everything I need right here with you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, enjoying the peace and comfort of being together. Sophie's Min. Dee drifted back to the conversation with Rachel, but it felt so distant now. Ethan was a part of her past, and she had finally accepted that. She was done waiting for someone who would never be the man she needed. It was time to focus on the present, on the man who had stood by her all along. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the park, James turned to Sophie with a thoughtful expression. Sophie, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Sophie looked at him curiously. What is it? James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it to reveal a delicate ring, simple yet beautiful, with a sparkle that caught the light just right. Sophie, James said, his voice thick with emotion, will you marry me? Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the ring, her heart racing. She had never imagined that this moment would come so soon, but here it was. James had always been the one for her, the one who had stood by her, who had loved her through it all. Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Yes, I will. James's face lit up with a smile that made Sophie's heart soar. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and in that moment, everything felt right. The past, with all its pain and heartbreak, finally felt like it had no hold over her. She was ready for the future, for the life she would build with James by her side. As they stood up and hugged each other, the world seemed to fall away. It was just them, together, in this moment of joy. Sophie knew that from this day forward, she would never have to look back. She had found her happiness, and nothing, no one, could take that away. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie's heart felt light. She had let go of the past, and in doing so, had created the future she had always dreamed of, a future with James, a future full of love, laughter, and the promise of a new beginning.